Hello, everybody. Welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. I'm really excited today about our topic. We've had a series of Grand Rounds throughout the year on health disparities, on diversity and equity, and anti-racism. And I'm really looking forward to hearing today about the de-escalation program that a lot of people have put work into. And so I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Taylor Laflamme, who is going to introduce our session for today and our speakers as well. Dr. Laflamme.
Thank you, Dr. Hirsch. We are going to have a panel discussion today. I'm going to take a moment to introduce two of our facilitators, and then they will introduce the others who are part of the panel. The first, Dr. Camilla Krib-Faberson, completed her residency training here, as well as a chief residency, and is now a pediatric complexivist and public health practitioner who works within our transitional care unit, as well as for the Department of Public Health, supporting both California Children's Services and Family and Children's Services. And she was involved in the task force that worked on developing the BCH de-escalation program. Dr. Karina Jacopetti was also on that same task force, and after completing residency here has become a pediatric hospitalist and bioethicist working in our hospital medicine and pain and palliative care services here at Mission Bay. And with that, I will turn it over to them and looking forward to hearing the discussion.
Taylor, go ahead and share my screen. Thank you all so much for having us. We're really delighted to be here with you and to have the opportunity to speak on this topic, which is so important to all of us here. And we would like to introduce our guest speakers, both second-year pediatric residents Liz Young and Hannah Corman. Thank you so much for being with us.
And then Janique Bell, the amazing new care support team, or the de-escalation team program manager, can sadly not be with us today because of an emergency. However, we have several panelists who are part of the anti-racism subcommittee of the de-escalation task force who are here today. Dr. Kiati Brambot, Roberto Vargas, Susan Conrad, and Jamila Nightingale. Before we start, Karina and I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and appreciate Jamila in particular. Jamila is our senior author behind this presentation. Jamila, we are so grateful to you and your mentorship for the rigor and brilliance of your work in anti-racism and for encouraging us to maintain clarity, heart, and integrity in the messages we hope to convey. We could not have done this without you. A deepest thanks to you for all of your time, effort, and support. Next slide. We have no conflicts of interest to disclose. So we are going to start today by analyzing the problem of racialized policing in the hospital context. Hannah will share the residents' literature review and their original call to action. We'll spend the bulk of our time discussing barriers to institutional change. This past year, there has been an increasing attention to anti-racism in our world, but it seems one area where it's easy to get stuck is when translating theory into practice. So our overarching goal here is to share themes that come up regularly in anti-racism work, using the de-escalation team process as a case study to make these themes more concrete. We'll then discuss the racism as a root cause framework, a helpful tool to sift through challenges in the work and to generate a shared mental model and identify the steps forward. And finally, we'll spend the last 20 minutes highlighting the transdisciplinary nature of these efforts with our panel discussion. Next slide.
As we all witnessed, the nationwide Black Lives Matter movement last summer called for an end to anti-Black violence, racialized policing, and police brutality following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless other Black individuals. During the same time, in our own children's hospital here at Mission Bay, there were several what we'll be calling security never events that targeted Black patients and families and mirrored what we were protesting nationally. And we've all seen time and time again that even in spaces where families come at their most vulnerable to seek care, white folks, non-Black people of color, and the systems we all live and work in read Black individuals as threatening or aggressive and weaponize fear with use of security and police, which results in traumatizing Black families. It was important for both of us to note here what you've probably already noticed, which is that I am multiracial, Chinese and white, and Camila is white. So neither of us giving the main presentation today are Black, when clearly there are Black individuals who are deeply engaged in this de-escalation pilot. In this hour, we'll be talking about the vital nature of centering Black voices when discussing anti-Black racism. So we want to acknowledge this tension up front and state that this is not the representation that is needed. And we want to share our hope for the direction our institution moves in, which is one where we prioritize and celebrate Black representation in hiring, promotion, and compensation, one where we do not expect Black individuals to exclusively hold the labor of explaining racism, and one where Black people can speak openly and say the things we're planning to say with our sites of power and privilege without fear of repercussions.
One of the main tensions we want to reflect on collectively throughout this hour is naming the difference between comfort and safety. The never events that Karina referred to in our hospital generated painful recognition that our security team is often called on families of color under the guise of a safety concern, when in reality, this is from a feeling of discomfort. Feelings of comfort and discomfort are informed in each of us by our own lived experiences. And because all of our structures are steeped in anti-Black racism, we, particularly white people, can conflate feeling unsafe and feeling uncomfortable. Unless we address interventions that increase a system's tolerance of discomfort and a white person's tolerance of their own discomfort, we cannot move forward to racial equity. Next slide. Our system had to develop responses to the future scenarios or events that would de-emphasize security involvement so that we would never have another never event. To help orient you to our project, here's a timeline for the major events of the last 9 months, starting in July with a call to action and culminating in the de-escalation pathway pilot just 3 weeks ago. Pretty quick change for an institution, you'll note. But first, we want to highlight the voices of our residents who leverage their physician privilege to advocate at the highest levels of our institution. They channeled the collective distress of our hospital community into a well-researched, passionate letter that was signed by over 900 individuals, including many of you. They presented a literature review to Chancellor Hawgood and the Safety Task Force, and their advocacy ultimately led to the formation of the De-escalation Task Force at BCH in San Francisco. We'd like to turn it over to Hannah Corman, one of our many brilliant pediatric residents who worked on the project, to share their rationale, literature findings, and recommendations that sparked the movement. Next slide.
Thank you for having us, and thank you to everybody on the panel for carrying this work forward. I want to mention again that what I'm going to share, it comes from the collective effort of a group of about 14 current pediatrics residents who are all involved in this advocacy. Next slide, please. So first we wanted to look at what does the data say about racial disparities in hospital violence? And this was motivated by our experiences with our never events with our patients. And these were the only 2 studies available that we could find. The first study comes from the University of Michigan. This looked at over 1,000 security calls over the course of 8 years and found that Black patients and their guests were 2 times more likely to have security called than white patients and their guests. And the second study comes from ZSFG Emergency Department. This was shared with everybody from the Department of Public Health in San Francisco, showing that Black patients made up 24% of ED visits, but 70% of use of force incidents over the course of the year. So even though there are only these 2 studies available on racial disparities in hospital violence, we have reason to believe that these studies reflect what is going on in the hospital more broadly, because what is described here inside the hospital reflects national trends of violence outside the hospital with over-policing of Black communities. And so as residents, one of our hopes is that UCSF and all hospitals nationally can commit to this type of transparency because we need to know where we're starting from. Next slide, please. So this is a direct quote from the Michigan paper, and this was published in the background of the paper of why the study was done. And essentially, one of the chaplains approached hospital leadership with concerns that security was often being called when the more appropriate referral would have been to spiritual care. And specifically, the chaplain observed that security was called more often for Black patients and their visitors than for white patients and their visitors. And as residents, we have seen that when there is a family or a person in distress in the hospital, that the hospital system can respond with compassion for one group and violence for another. And this is where our advocacy is coming from. Next slide, please. So our group of residents conducted a literature review. We looked at around 20 studies, many of which were meta-analyses on de-escalation benefits and best practices. And these are some of the outcomes measured on this slide. And essentially the most important thing on this slide is that every single study published had a one-sided view focusing on frontline staff safety. And these studies framed patients and families as the source of violence and staff as the victims of workplace violence. But what we know from Michigan and ZSFG is that it is also flipped around and that patients and families also experience violence in the hospital. And one of our hopes is that UCSF can contribute to the literature here, essentially with a proof of concept that de-escalation can be used as an intervention to eliminate the known racial disparities in violence. Next slide, please. So lastly, we just wanted to share that de-escalation was one of our original asks to leadership, but is only a piece of what it takes to make structural change. Our group has also asked for a commitment that these programs would be well-funded and funded in the long term, and that police and security would not be overfunded, as their presence can lead to over-policing and hyper-surveillance of families of color. We asked for a pledge that each intervention will prioritize Black leaders and leaders of color in positions of power within all of these programs, and that their work is appropriately compensated. Commitment to objective and family-centered language. We know that the language we use that's used in the chart, that is used in flags in the chart, that is used in sign out can perpetuate racial stereotypes that are dangerous. So we've asked that our hospital system work on objective and family-centered language. And a commitment to making the data on security calls public, like ZSFG and Michigan did. We had a number of other asks. We shared all of these in multiple meetings with hospital leadership so that this isn't a one-time solution, but true systemic change. Next slide, please. And lastly, we just wanted to share some voices of pediatric residents on why this work is so important to us.
We are in the midst of a nationwide reckoning on pervasive and systemic anti-Black racism and violence. Recent security incidents in our hospital only underscore that our medical system is not exempt from this reckoning.
We must acknowledge the ubiquitous forces at play: institutionalized white supremacy, anti-Black racism, and police violence under our watch.
We know that actions speak louder than words. If we promote a public image of action and justice, but do not abide by those values internally, we continue to actively promote structural and interpersonal racism rather than defy it.
Our hospital is supposed to be a place for healing, and we made an oath to do no harm. All families deserve to feel safe in the hospital, and we feel compelled to use our positions of power to elevate our patient stories.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you to all of the other residents who led this effort. Picking up from that call to action, the next 6 months of the de-escalation task force work involved editing behavioral response policies, creating an alternate pathway that relies less on security, and exploring trainings to support this program. We just want to highlight one important goal written into this work, which is this one here, which is to increase our system's tolerance to a normal range of emotional responses, which gets back to the idea of not conflating comfort and safety that Camila mentioned. And it's also worth noting again that this work was initially crafted with dual priorities. So the first is dismantling structural racism in behavioral response policies. And the second is decreasing workplace violence events that disproportionately impact frontline staff. And as a physician who has the luxury of walking out of a room in a way that our bedside nurses and PCAs do not, I want to emphasize each as important goals. And the hope was that the same intervention could address both. Unfortunately, the longer this work progressed, the clearer it became that because of the existing structural racism that's baked into our institutions and structures at every level, work with any additional priority other than anti-racism will always end up deprioritizing anti-racism in the process. That is just what our systems are set up to do. And so we'll come back to that point throughout. This is just a brief look at what the pilot structure looks like. Essentially, the thought was, if there's discomfort, if there's disagreement, there are other existing people in our hospital who can and should support families and staff instead of security. This is definitely still a work in progress, but the goal was to find who are the most effective people and then create a structure and policy that has them responding instead. So for instance, social workers and chaplains with their expertise in trauma-informed approaches are almost always more appropriate and effective than security. We'll also share that there are two biggest structural changes to the security roles. And the first is having them at bedside only in a very narrowly defined set of circumstances here in level 4, where a severe, immediate, and highly probable risk to safety is present, such as threat with a weapon. And the second is that security is called independent of the team. They must notify and activate the team to respond.
What Karina just showed you is where the program has landed to date. Next, we want to shift gears to talk about the challenges in imbuing anti-racism throughout this project. The patterns or barriers to anti-racist institutional change are unfortunately no way unique or specific to this de-escalation team. Instead, the reason we're talking about them today is that they arise again and again as we attempt to be anti-racist in a historically racist system. Next slide. One of the first barriers has been the lack of precise data. One of the frameworks we've looked at, called Erasing Institutional Bias, suggests that setting a clear intention based on data is the best way to start dismantling structural racism. Hannah shared that ZSFG has been transparent about the disproportionate impact of security calls on Black patient population there. Empirically, at UCSF Benioff, we've seen a similar trend. However, there has been no data collection system in place to transparently report these events. The data we do have, which I've referenced on the chart on the right, while this is incomplete and inaccurate, it still raises concern. For example, when reviewing 809 security flags placed in EPIC at UCSF Health over the last year, 21% of the flags were placed for Black patients, and yet we know the population of Black residents in San Francisco is 5.2%. The lack of these baseline data has made it challenging to determine benchmarks and set goals for institutional change. Many meetings with multiple stakeholders have noted the lack of these data and brought up questions like, are you sure there are more security events for Black families? Or, I didn't realize this was about race. I thought this was just a concern about staff safety. It's made advocacy incredibly challenging because we have not had the proof that our system wants, that there's really a problem. And because the forces of structural racism, it's easy to dismiss any empiric evidence or the emotional calls to action because of these lack of data. Next slide. Just as we see in so many other projects, the second barrier we want to talk about is that Black voices have not been explicitly centered in this work, even though the mistreatment of Black families was the impetus for these changes. As Karina mentioned, as a de-escalation team got going, there were dual priorities of staff and family safety and anti-racism. And because it's so challenging to hold anti-racism at the core of any project, this priority has been made secondary time and time again. Another pattern we noticed was that there was a slip towards supporting all families at BCH. Many of the conversations in the working group involved, well, what about this group? Patients with disabilities or families who speak languages other than English. While it's critically important to ensure that a program intervening against anti-Black racism does not inadvertently harm another already marginalized group, the attempt to create a program that would serve all families equally just diluted out how precisely it supported Black families in particular. Next slide.
Do you want to do that at the table?
Oh yes, thank you. Next, we should also consider that those tapped to do the work on the task force were people in leadership positions already, who in our institution are predominantly white. White people is who our system advances, and importantly, who has the bandwidth and the time to participate in yet another effort on anti-racism that's uncompensated, both financially and emotionally. Some of the decisions and ideas made offline by these white folks who naturally have blind spots were found to be concerning by our anti-racism subcommittee and other BIPOC members. As concerns were brought back to the main group, it put the onus on the BIPOC individuals in the group to evaluate and explain why something that had already been drafted may inadvertently lead to harm for the Black and Brown communities. If acknowledged by the broader group, then BIPOC individuals were often asked to find the solution and edit the draft form, rather than being the initial leaders in building an anti-racist product from the ground up. And finally, this cannot be emphasized enough. Almost all participation in the task force has been uncompensated and voluntary, which again perpetuates racism in a multitude of ways. Now, next slide. Sorry about that.
Bye. Another barrier we see so often in anti-racism work is a sense of urgency. And this ends up maintaining existing racist structures rather than supporting the needed transformational and long-term change. So how it tends to work is that racism or oppression is identified, and then we get really uncomfortable that we're being racist. And so we have an impatience to fix things, which often assumes that there is even a quick fix. And on top of that, there's often practical concern for losing momentum when racism finally has a moment at center stage. We naturally want to take advantage of that attention because it has a very real impact on which projects are funded and prioritized. But because we experience this urgency, we reach for the toolkit that's the most accessible. So it's easier and faster to try to edit existing structures rather than dismantling them and starting from scratch. So this means we do things like look back on old behavioral response policies or rely on best practice or gold standard trainings. But by definition, those things are not working, or else there wouldn't be a problem. Right? And so those existing structures were designed by white people, and for white systems. So the real need is to start over and create structures with anti-racism central, not as an afterthought or a secondary priority. But that takes work and time and funding. And so how this tended to play out in our work group was that in this group working on this program, there were many people who had personally cared for the patients and families who were targets of these security never events over the summer. And so carrying this vicarious trauma, everyone felt the urgent need to make sure nothing like that could ever happen to any of our patients again, not on our watch, right? But that sense of urgency created a pressure to move things forward quickly. And we often heard it's only the pilot, or perfection is the enemy of the good. But what those comments ignore is something we often think about in clinical medicine, in bioethics, in many other fields, which is that the worst case scenario isn't actually that a new intervention wouldn't have a benefit. The worst case is that it would risk doing more harm, right? And so there was a need to ask at all points in the project, is there enough rigor and support here for even this initial version of the pilot or this initial training to avoid causing harm and to have some benefit for Black families? And then how do you balance the risk of not getting it right with the risk to our patients every day that the current system is allowed to continue? And so in trying to navigate this balance, the pilot was actually pushed back a couple times for this very reason. We wanted to give just a concrete example of how urgency can be dangerous. So as Camila noted, without data as a starting point, we had to start somewhere else. So we started with the existing behavioral response policy. And don't worry about the details here, but on the left are samples of wording pulled out from each of the 3 levels of response in this policy. And at the bottom of the graphic, you can see that security is listed as the end state for all level 2 and 3 responses. So if you're only looking at this from the lens of staff safety, one picture is painted where maybe it makes sense that you want security present for disruptive behavior or for aggression. But if you look at this through specifically an anti-racism lens, you can really see where this language and policy reinforces structural racism, perpetuates bias, and results in dramatically different outcomes for different patients and families. So you can see, for instance, how our system labels Black mothers as demanding versus white mothers saying the same things in the same tone are good advocates for their children. And you can see how our system would track white boys and white men who raise their voices as angry and just needing a little space to cool off, versus Black boys and Black men demonstrating the same normal emotion are interpreted as verbally abusive or aggressive, which would generate an immediate security response under this policy. So this example really highlights how policies can be tools of white supremacy. We make exceptions to policies for families we choose to give the benefit of the doubt to, but we point to policy to justify action against families we already track as a threat, whether consciously or unconsciously, the moment they walk in our doors. And so with that in mind, the goal of this work and the need in any anti-racism work is to emphasize policy and structural change, because if policy is a tool of structural racism, it must be central to dismantling that same racism. And the last barrier we want to highlight is the focus on trainings rather than systems. And we had 3 takeaway points here coming up in the work. The first is, how do you identify useful training? We quickly learned that there was no one existing training for everything we needed: nonviolent de-escalation skills, trauma-informed care, and especially anti-racism. And even after reaching out to our networks, we couldn't identify any de-escalation training with an explicit anti-racism agenda, which is a big problem, because if you're doing de-escalation without anti-racism being central, how would that not risk perpetuating the very problem this team was formed to address? Second, there needs to be a robust process and the right people evaluating whether a training achieved its stated goals. So for instance, while CPI, Crisis Prevention Institute training, was excellent at teaching nonviolent hands-on skills, we found that it also purported to teach trauma-informed care. But when team members with content expertise in trauma-informed care experienced the training, they were best positioned to pick up medically inaccurate information and mischaracterizations of trauma that could actually be harmful or even be weaponized. And so it's similarly vital that trainings are evaluated for anti-racist principles and practices by the people best positioned to know what those do and do not look like. And then finally, when racism is identified, it's easier to propose training individuals as a solution. So another implicit bias training, rather than the more difficult work of interrogating structures. But there are actually no data to suggest that training changes outcomes. And there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that it doesn't. And the best example here comes from implicit bias training for NYPD officers. And a most recent study was published in 2020. And this study showed that implicit bias training was shown to increase these officers' awareness and interest in the topic, but it did not impact their behavior or the racial disparities in their law enforcement actions pre and post training. So there's a real danger here, which is that it would be problematic to present to our internal and external community that trainings happened. We are now experts in anti-racist de-escalation. And there should instead be a transparent discussion that training is important, but should not be the focus of anti-racism work.
One of the things that we've found most helpful as we've tried to grapple with these challenges of this work is to look towards the literature to help guide our analysis of the challenges in systems change. One framework we want to highlight is the Racism as the Root Cause approach, a framework proposed by Dr. Zaya Malawa and her team. There are 4 main components of this approach to making lasting anti-racism systems change. The first is that the impact should be focused precisely on the racially marginalized group rather than all groups. The second is that the focus should be on system change rather than individual change, focusing on changing policies, changing environments or systems, as opposed to changing the people themselves. Third is that these changes should be designed for the long term and be sustainable. You're all pediatricians, so I like to say we treat constipation for as long as constipation's been around. We've got to treat the problem for as long as it's been around, and racism has been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We should be designing interventions that we expect to continue for that long. And finally, third is that finally, reparations, which seek to repair historical injustices by shifting resources, power, and opportunities to racially marginalized groups. We should be seeking here to hire and pour resources into our Black community, both eliciting their voices and wisdom and shifting our institutions' resources into the hands of this marginalized group. Next slide. So using the Racism as a Root Cause framework, we were actually able to structure how we advocated for particular opportunities for next steps for this de-escalation program. I wanted to highlight just a couple of examples. To focus on precise impact, we advocated that the institution, which has agreed to support data gathering, analysis, and dissemination of safety and security events by race and ethnicity. We have also heard commitment of community review by BIPOC communities of the new framework, which was great. In thinking about systems change, the Anti-Racism Subcommittee has advocated for an external equity consultant to help our system identify specific structures and opportunities going forward. For long-term impact, we are really pleased that there's a wonderful new program manager, Janique Bell, whose position is not funded on a grant cycle, and thus she'll be able to continue this work over the next several years. Finally, for reparations, well, this is actually still a huge need and opportunity of the project. We really need to focus on funded community engagement, shifting UCSF's resources into the hands of the Black community who are most affected by this work. Next slide. So in conclusion, Karina and I have walked you through one case study of the challenges of implementing anti-racism change in a large health system that has suffered from structural racism for generations. We have learned that anti-racism endeavors must center anti-racism principles and practices at the core in order to be effective. And we've recognized that when things get muddy or unclear or uncomfortable, it actually is really helpful to look for frameworks to analyze where things are going wrong. We have found solace and an opportunity to improve our communication when we use these frameworks, like the racism is the root cause approach, which makes us more effective advocates and allies for change. Next slide. So these are a couple of references we just wanted to show you. Next slide.
And then before transitioning to our panel, we do want to extend our deep thanks to the De-escalation Task Force leadership, the incredible number of people across the institution who provided mentorship and consultation with us over the last 6 months, and all of the people carrying this work forward in all of its iterative changes. And we want to bookend our presentation with one more celebration of the 14 phenomenal pediatric resident leaders shown here, and emphasize and thank them for their vision, advocacy, and their continued work. And thank you to the 900 plus people across professions, including so many of you, who put your weight and influence behind that initial letter to collectively spark that movement. And speaking of the power of collective work, one of the most salient points we learned from meetings with community-based organizations was just how essential relationship building is when it comes to equity work. You cannot train racism away, as we've talked about, but we can form robust and specifically accountable communities of practice. What we heard from our community partners again and again is that in conjunction with structural changes, not instead of, community and relationships are an integral part of building sustainable anti-racism movements. And our personal experience definitely reflects this. One of the great joys of this work has been collaborating with a truly interdisciplinary team. And we really want to make sure that you get to hear from a few of these people themselves. So with that, we would like to welcome our panel.
First, even though Janique Bell could not be with us today, we do want to publicly welcome her as our Care Support Program Manager, who's joined this team in March and brings with her tremendous skill and a vision for this work. We will miss her voice this hour. It is an honor to introduce the amazing people we've been working with on the Anti-Racism Subcommittee over the last year. And I'll invite our panelists to turn on their cameras now. So the first is Jamila Nightingale, who's a medical social worker on C5. We have Kiati Brambut, the Director of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Consult Liaison Service. Susan Conrad, who is a chaplain and the Director of Spiritual Care Services. And Roberto Vargas, the Associate Director of the Center for Community Engagement. We'll start first by giving the floor to Jamila. And as we do that, please put any additional questions that you have in the chat. I see one already coming in, so that's great. Keep it coming. Jamila, we were hoping that you could talk about some of the highlights for you in working on this project. What has given you hope for the potential impact of this work?
Hi, thank you. Hope for the potential impact of this work. I think that what has been most affirming is seeing the collaborations in terms of moving forward and the willingness to really talk about the hardships that are happening in this hospital and the disparities that are happening in this hospital, and to have people both in terms of direct line workers at bedside that are motivated and interested in gathering information to do this work and do this work in a way that's going to have a significant impact, but also from both management and administration in terms of making an investment to do this work. And the change that I've seen in terms of the willingness and ability to really have some frank discussions around race. The university's willingness to start to look at the data to make sure that this work that we're doing is informed, to make sure that we are assessing impact, that we have milestones, that we have markers, And although there's limited research around this work, one of the highlights that I have seen in this work is we're continuing to identify who are the people that are leaders in this type of work so that we can learn from those lessons that they've already come to understand, and we can use those to guide us in the work that we're doing. So those are some of the highlights, and being heard. I think that we are continuing to see that leadership here at the hospital is looking beyond some of the continued voices, but looking at new voices to really highlight and identify how we can partner and how we can better understand opportunities to overcome some of the barriers that we keep running into.
Thanks, Jamila. The first question that we see here in the Q&A, Karina, I'll go ahead and read. It says that this work highlights the importance of a transparency in changing policies and structures. UCSF is a very hierarchical organization. Transparency can be a threat to hierarchy. How do you expect the institution to respond to the community's demand that it will become more transparent and actively anti-racist? And what backlash can we expect and plan for? We were wondering, Susan, if you'd be willing to try to answer that part first, and then other panelists as well.
Hi, everyone. Sure, I'm happy to. And I feel like this is a good experience for me of accountability and being willing to be uncomfortable as a white person addressing this. I really appreciate the question. I think this question highlights the reality of power. That I believe it was Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. And I think we need to be really clear-eyed about these structures of power. And that is not to, ever demonize any individual, but just to be aware of that. And I think what I've experienced for myself is the need to be really persevering, and that it's not possible to do this alone. So I know as a white person that when I've felt uncomfortable about speaking truth, about really pushing for anti-racist action, especially around policies, that it's been really important for me to be in alliance. I believe Jamila used this really important framing in alliance with folks across disciplines, and that's including everybody here on this panel and far beyond. So I think the way we move forward is to recognize that, yeah, there very well may be some pushback. And then I think we also, from my spiritual perspective, we are prophetic in the sense that we are calling our organization back to its mission. And the residents spoke about that, the medical residents spoke about that so brilliantly, that we have a duty to not do harm. And so I firmly believe as we continue to call this institution back to those principles, that there will be movement. And I think it's going to require discomfort. It's going to require ongoing perseverance. And it's going to be requiring white folks to do the work of withstanding failure and continuing to keep going, in the words of Brescia Wade, who is a Black author and spiritual care provider. And I would invite others, of course, on the panel to share as well.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, I see. Do you want to go to the BCH question?
Yeah, this is such an interesting experience trying to figure out how to sift this and assign roles in real time. But Karina, did you want to introduce the second question?
Yes, thank you. We were hoping to ask this question from Dr. Benke, which is how are BCH leadership directly involved in supporting policy and system change? And so, for instance, CMOs, presidents, et cetera. And we were hoping that Chiati, maybe you could first give a little perspective from what we've seen for our group, and then Roberto, in your positions, looking at this work from the bird's eye view across the institution, we were hoping you could fill in after with that perspective.
Sure. I think that it started with the leadership being asked to have a call to action with the letter that went out and appointing of the de-escalation committee that was led, by a few members. And then I think there was the composition of the team itself, inviting people from different disciplines, inviting people who are looking at it from different angles, including, our community partners and Roberto, who was really key to this entire work. And as we presented this work, we've also had the opportunity to, form our anti-racism subcommittee, but then ask for a meeting with the steering committee and present our findings and present our challenges and our demands. And my experience has been that they've been open to feedback, open to hearing about our experiences. My hope would be that as we move forward, it would become more of an automatic, not a ask, but an automatic, plan in place or a structure in place where these meetings are happening and accountability is baked into the system.
Thank you, Kathy, and the entire panel. As folks, I hope will agree, this is a very powerful framing for understanding where we are as an institution and what we need to do to move forward. I serve on the safety task force to make recommendations to the chancellor, and by way of putting out the word to try and understand who's got some frameworks around getting at safety and de-escalation that are anti-racist and trauma informed. A friend of mine who works at Mission Bay told me about this effort, which is how I got connected to this effort. And then by way of my participation here, got invited to participate at the Parnassus Medical Center and an effort there, learn more about other colleagues at SFGH doing similar work around trying to get at de-escalation methods that don't rely so heavily on the sheriff's department. And I think there are still tremendous opportunities system-wide for engaging community more deeply, particularly those communities that we know to be disproportionately burdened by how we deploy our security and policing resources, which are, specifically Black community, Brown community folks in the homeless community, and folks serving those three communities at least. So I think there's a lot of work to be done still. With regards to the question earlier about discomfort and a backlash, I completely expect discomfort and backlash. I think that is a natural progression around what happens when we advance shifts in structural oppression, which is what you all are proposing, which is what we as an institution have explicitly declared we are attempting to do. I expect it to get uncomfortable. And I think it's really important that we be willing to get uncomfortable. We be willing to challenge ourselves and challenge our system in order to move forward and in order to be truly anti-racist and trauma-informed as a system. And I hope that by way of engaging local communities in particular, it'll help us best understand how to best serve those communities that we know we are disproportionately impacting and disproportionately burdening with regards to how we currently deploy our security and safety measures. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jamila, I know you were going to introduce Janique's particular leadership role. I think now would be a good time since she can't be here. Is that okay?
Yeah. Unfortunately, our co-care support program manager, Janique Bell, is not available to be with us today due to an unexpected emergency that required her attention. And she asked me to have the opportunity to just kind of introduce her role. Janique Bell has been serving in this new and unique position for approximately a month. Janique has been employed with UCSF Medical Center for more than 10 years and is both invested and familiar with the supports and services needed by family and staff. Prior to fulfilling this role, Janique has been employed at UCSF in the leadership role as Assistant Unit Director, Lactation Consultant, Birth Center RN, and Charge Nurse. It has been my observation during the initial stages of this program that Janique is committed to prioritizing the creation of safe spaces in which Black families receive equitable care. As a direct result of ensuring equity in care, it is the perspective of UCSF that an added benefit to prioritizing the safety of Black families will inadvertently support our ability to be more responsive
and equitable to all of our families, and that de-escalation supports our bedside staff in creating a safer space for employees also. In a prior ground round, Janique highlighted the benefits of this presentation to highlight the very specific actions and collaborations that have led to the creation of the Code Care Support Program. As Janique and her team are preparing to launch this program throughout UCSF, Mission Bay, she will be available in providing direct support to the Mission Bay campus with the intent to provide more direct information and feedback around next steps regarding how the details around how this program will roll out in each unit throughout Mission Bay. As her absence was unexpected today, we will look forward to alternative opportunities for Janique to provide her direct message of next steps so that she can provide them to each unit and floor as we prepare for rollout. As I said before, Janique has shown appreciation for this ground round and highlighting UCSF de-escalation program development and looking at the case study of challenges and opportunities. And I've found that she believes that this is a great tool for us to continue to use around identifying future challenges and opportunities so we can continue to learn and grow as we do this work.
Thank you so much, Jamila. We're noticing a couple questions in the Q&A about frontline staff, safety versus comfort. How do we all collectively get to this understanding of normal range of emotions? I'm going to try to give a first pass answer to that one, and then I'll open it up to anyone else who would like to fill in. So I would say that I think a great strength of this work has been how truly interdisciplinary the working group has been. And it actually started as a more narrow group of people, and then through the inclusivity of leadership was actually expanded to include more and more roles and different individuals within each profession. And so there has been frontline staff engagement in the development of the program, and that we are all acknowledging that it is not on any one group of people that needs to do this learning, right? All of us, our entire system has a lot of growth to do in the area of not conflating safety, a safety risk with a feeling of discomfort. And this is something that we all actually need to develop a community of practice to do together. And so Jamila actually has been such a leader in creating spaces for this. And so the plan is to do team huddles where we're actually going to get a chance to think through and to talk through openly situations together. There's going to be additional training with a community partner, Glide, to do an experiential learning sort of immersion work. And frontline staff, even if they were not participating in the pilot development, have actually been integrated into groups going through that training and going through that learning together. And then there's also a need for, after each instance where this team responds, that we're building questions in to the structure of the debriefs each time. And these we've discussed need to be not, is racism showing up or was there oppression here, but instead to all get used to saying, how is racism functioning here, both interpersonally and from a systems perspective. And we've also acknowledged that it cannot be Black individuals bringing that up every time, that actually like truly needs to be all of us, and especially our white folks and our non-Black people of color at our institution raising that question. I would love to open it up to anyone else because I think that these are, this is like really at the heart of this work. And so if anyone else has other perspectives, would love you to fill in.
In response to the anonymous attendee, I think one of the things that's really important about the Code Care team is that they're working closely with security. So one of the goals that we'll have is that we're working as one unit. So while it's important for anyone to call in if they feel threatened or worried or concerned based on whatever the policies outline and identify, in working closely with security, there will be a tiered response around how do we respond to that? What is the response to those worries and concerns? And how do we do it in a way that we ensure safety for all of our families and for all of our staff? And that's going to require ongoing conversation and working from a data point, which the de-escalation committee is not just working directly with security, but security is an integral part
of the De-escalation committee. So we're definitely working from a unified front in terms of how do we respond to biases, assessments, perceptions, and how do we make sure that we respond to those safely? And that's exactly what we're trying to do.
I think, yeah, thank you for that. And I think the question around, how do we shift the culture at the institution is important. And I think you all have proposed some very powerful strategies for doing that, right? And I deeply appreciate that what this group together is proposing is structural change, right? I think it's important, as you all have said, to get at training that is helpful in doing anti-racist trauma-informed work and approaches to de-escalation. And I'm really happy we've identified a willing and able partner in Glide to help do some of that training. And we're working to help modify other trainings as well. And as you all have pointed out, it's not exclusively going to get done by way of training. And you all have proposed some policy change with regards to the structure for how we use protocol in addressing de-escalation needs and relying on security in the most severe of circumstances and with very specific criteria needing to be met before we do that. And so I think that it requires all of those things, right, to do this cultural change, and taking a look at what are the specific needs of each campus and each clinical space, which I think you all have done so adeptly. And I think that what this model proposes can be replicated in some ways and adapted for other circumstances in clinical and campus spaces across the institution.
I may add to that. I think these are all such important points and things that we have considered. And another, aspect of this is also looking forward and looking ahead. And we've had discussions about frontline care providers and how we can take steps and think about structurally and policies that they can reflect our population that we serve, so that we don't have providers who are predominantly white or providers who are predominantly non-Black race, and how we can look at our structures, whether they're requirements for certain certifications, and if they're linked to resource availability or having the resources to take a certain test, and how can we start looking at all of these things and maybe changing our requirements or changing how we are hiring and who we are hiring, so ultimately our task force or our workers and our people look like our patients, and that will also be sort of something that we have to think about in parallel and not independent of these things to really get to that point in the future.
I just wanted to address, or we wanted to address the several questions thinking about pregnant and laboring women giving birth in our hospital. The de-escalation team initially started with the goal of being an all BCH, including the women's L&D unit as places to pilot this work. We have decided the pilot is rolling out on C5 as the first place because it's so complex, but there are plans to expand to the birth center more specifically. And Janique is from the birth center originally and really knows that system incredibly well. And so she will, I think, be an excellent sort of person to bring this work and translate the unique needs in the birth center itself. We do know that, we know empirically that women who are cared for by Black physicians and babies who are cared for by Black physicians who are Black have a decrease in their infant mortality. And so making sure that anti-racism is specifically translated into the birth center to try to help mitigate some of the effects of racism from the very first moments of life is critically important to the team. And because it started in the pediatric hospital, that's someplace that we're starting and then going to pilot shortly. I don't know if others have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge of our, and not just our, I mean, I think clinical the clinical workforce nationally isn't as diverse as our patient population, and that's a national problem. And I think all the efforts around expanding diversity in our workforce are helpful in that regard. And I think it also points to another reason for why it's so important to engage local communities, folks with lived experience and folks with experience serving those communities we know to be disproportionately burdened, so that they have a voice in helping shape what we do and how we do it.
Great, thanks. Susan, I guess we'll have you answer this last question and then we'll turn it over to Sandrine. Oh, Jamila, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say in addition that it has been impressive, this work. I think it's really hard because, let's be honest, I think when we're looking at a large institution, we're often worried, is this work going to be real? Is there going to be an impact? And so I just want to highlight that we are really working not to just focus on being busy. We are really working, like Roberto pointed out, at how do we create structural change that has an impact? How do we partner with administration? How do we do the work directly at bedside? How do we engage in the conversations with bedside? How do we make sure that this work is sustainable? And so that is something that we are actively working on as a team by collaborating with community partners in all of the way that Roberto highlighted. But we do understand the importance and the necessity of this work, and just wanting to reassure people that we're really focusing on that schedule.
Thank you so much, Jamila, and thank you to everyone. We'll pass it over to Sandrine to close. And Sandrine, perhaps if you, I'm seeing this question from Livy last in the Q&A, and I think just touching on, as we look forward in this work, in your position, I'm curious if you have any reflections on specifically the leadership aspect and the question of accountability, which comes up time and time again, and is I think a very dear and deep hope to everyone working in our system.
Yeah, thank you, first of all, to all of you for this really thoughtful presentation about incredibly important work, and thanks to the residents and the other trainees who've spearheaded the advocacy to get this going. I just going to say a couple of quick things. I'm not sure if I can do justice to the entire accountability piece, but I do actually think that the leadership is doing a fair amount to address anti-racism across the board. The one thing that has become very clear to me, especially over the past few weeks, is that we're not so good collectively as leadership communicating and finding good communication channels to people that we're doing this work, maybe not being explicit enough about it. But in particular to the question about BCH leadership, the CMOs, the presidents, there is actually a group that meets almost weekly. It was last night, I was part of that, where all the medical directors are invited to really think how every single unit can start working on anti-racism efforts, including these type of efforts, but much broader, because I think you highlighted very clearly that there is also a need for training to make people aware of their biases, to make sure that everybody actually understands that this work is important, that we're all getting on the same page. None of this, of course, is going as fast as everybody wants to, but as you highlighted yourself, sometimes rush is not the right way to go, and being thoughtful and getting everybody on board and doing this in a way that everybody actually participates is more important than speed. In the same vein, the question about what's required, I don't think we're making that very clear either to particularly our trainees, but DEI training is required of all faculty and staff, and the degree to which that training goes, whether it's an hour module or a day-long course or multiple days, etc., currently depends on the status that you have, the impact that you have, the leader, not the status, but the impact and the leadership that you have in the organization. So our leadership is required to do much more in-depth training at this moment, but I anticipate that to actually really have a snowball effect. So there's a lot going on, and I do actually think that people are starting to get it. I wouldn't say get it, but are starting to get it. Change like this is always slow. And it's true, there's lots of competing priorities, but for the leadership, it's really risen to the top, and it's on everybody's mind. I want to be cognizant of the time. I see on the chat that people really want to invite folks to join the movement. And so we will make sure that, first of all, the recording of this is available to everyone. Look for an email from Cherise. I will also send out a repeat email, and we will make sure that these conversations continue. I also want to highlight that every single Grand Rounds this month has a health equity or an anti-racism focus. So please check them out. We are really wondering how we can do better and more, etc. But we're integrating this into almost everything that we do. And I want to make sure that I give Dr. Hirsch an opportunity to close us all off. So
Can I say just one really quick thing, Sandrine? Thank you so much. I just want to say the Anti-Racism Subcommittee welcomes folks who are committed to this work, who have experience doing this work, to reach out to us. That's part of our sustainability. And I also just want to share really briefly words from Mia Birdsong, who is a powerful Black activist, storyteller, change maker. Says accountability, we think of it as a punishment to keep us from messing up. It's actually about living our values that fully embrace and honor the humanity of others. So may accountability be a way for us to be in relationship. Truly, anti-racism is a way that can bring us into our full humanity, being active in community. Thank you so much.
Beautifully said. Dr. Hirsch.
Yes, and just want to wrap up by, first of all, thanking everybody who participated in this really important conversation. And that includes our panelists as well as the audience. I wish we had more time, but we'll have more opportunities to continue this discussion. And there's so much to do. The specific de-escalation project that has now been initiated, I'm really interested to see what we're going to learn from that and what the impact's going to be. So I think we need to have a follow-up once the program has been running for a while to see what we got right and what we got wrong and what we have to change as time goes along, so we continue to improve. So thanks everybody, and wish you all a good rest of your day.
Thanks for having us.